My name is Catherine, and for most of my life, I was the daughter who didn't cause trouble. I paid my own way through college. I married responsibly. I raised my daughter with structure, manners, and respect. And because of that, my parents always assumed I'd be fine, no matter what they did. My younger sister, Linda, was different. Linda needed help. Linda needed support. Linda needed money. And somehow, that always became my problem. The rare book collection didn't start with me. It belonged to my grandmother, Eleanor, my mother's mother. She was a quiet woman with steel in her spine, the kind who noticed everything and forgot nothing. When she died, she left her most treasured possession not to my parents, not to Linda, but to my daughter, Emily. Emily was only 6 at the time. People thought it was strange. But Grandma Eleanor told me once, "That child listens. She values things." The collection was priceless. First editions, signed copies, books protected like family members. We kept them in my parents' climate-controlled study temporarily because my house was under renovation. Big mistake. Last summer, my parents invited us over for dinner. My father barely looked at me. My mother smiled too much. Halfway through dessert, my mother said casually, "Oh, by the way, we sold the books." I laughed at first. I thought it was a joke. Then she added, "A private collector, $165,000. The room went quiet. My daughter froze. I asked, "You sold Emily's books?" My father cleared his throat. "Well, Catherine, they were just sitting there, and Linda's kids needed a proper home theatre. You know how important family time is." That's when I understood something very clearly. They didn't see my daughter as family. They saw her inheritance as spare change. My mother leaned forward. "Don't be dramatic. Emily is young. She won't even remember those books." That's when I smiled. Because what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Grandma Eleanor had anticipated this exact moment, and she had prepared me for it. As my parents relaxed, relieved by my silence, I reached into my purse and placed a single envelope on the table. My father's smile vanished when he saw my grandmother's handwriting, and that was just the beginning. My father stared at the envelope like it might explode. My mother reached for it first, but I placed my hand flat on top and shook my head. "No, read it out loud. All of it." Her smile wavered. The room felt smaller as my father opened the envelope and unfolded the letter. His voice was steady at first, confident even. But halfway through the first paragraph, it cracked. "If you are reading this," he read, "then you have done exactly what I warned you not to do." My mother swallowed hard. Grandma Eleanor's handwriting filled 3 pages. She'd anticipated everything: the favoritism, the excuses, the belief that they knew better than everyone else. The letter went on to explain that the books were never just a gift. They were a test. A trust had been created in my daughter's name, one that mirrored the collection's value and appreciated quietly over time. But there was a condition. If the books were ever sold without Emily's consent, the trust would immediately trigger a legal review of my parents' finances and assets tied to the estate. My father stopped reading. "What does that mean?" my mother asked sharply. I finally spoke, calm, almost gentle. "It means Grandma Eleanor knew you might do this, and she made sure you couldn't benefit from it." My sister Linda shifted in her chair. "This is ridiculous. You're bluffing." I pulled out my phone and slid it across the table. An email from the trust attorney sat open, time-stamped 2 hours earlier. Subject line: "Unauthorized asset liquidation confirmed." My father's face went grey. "You reported us?" he whispered. "I didn't have to," I said. "The buyer did. First editions over a certain value are automatically flagged. Grandma planned very carefully." That's when my mother raised her voice. "So what? They sold books. That money is already spent." I nodded. "I know, on Linda's home theatre." Linda snapped, "My kids deserve nice things." "And my daughter deserved her inheritance," I replied. The attorney's email was clear. Because the sale violated the trust's terms, my parents were now personally liable for restitution, not just the $165,000, but penalties. Their retirement accounts, the lake house, even the house we were sitting in was subject to review. My father sank back in his chair. "You wouldn't do this to us," my mother said, her voice trembling. "We're your parents." I looked at Emily, who was clutching her backpack, eyes wide but steady. "I didn't do this," I said. "You did. The moment you decided my child mattered less." That's when Linda stood up, furious. "So you're really going to destroy this family over some old books?" I smiled again. Because the books weren't the end. They were just the beginning. What none of them realized, what I hadn't told them yet, was that the trust wasn't the only thing Grandma Eleanor left behind. And the next letter was addressed to me. The second letter had been sitting in my safe for years. I never thought I'd need it. Grandma Eleanor gave it to me the day she signed her will. She pressed the envelope into my hands and said, "This is for when they show you who they really are." At the time, I thought she was being dramatic. She wasn't. After dinner that night, while my parents argued in hushed, panicked voices and Linda paced like a trapped animal, I stood up. "There's something else you should know," I said. They all looked at me. I reached into my purse again. Same handwriting, same cream-coloured envelope. But this one didn't go to them. My name was written across the front. My mother's voice shook. "What is that?" "This," I said, "is the part Grandma didn't trust you enough to hear." I opened it slowly. The letter was shorter, sharper. Grandma Eleanor wrote that she'd spent years watching how my parents treated Linda versus me. How mistakes were forgiven for one daughter and remembered forever for the other. How generosity only flowed in one direction. Then came the part that made my sister sit down. Grandma had left me controlling interest in the family property LLC, the one that owned the lake house, the investment rentals, and yes, the home my parents lived in. They had lifetime use rights, contingent on good faith stewardship of the estate, which they had just violated. My father stood abruptly. "That's not possible. We would have known." "You did know," I replied. "You just assumed it didn't matter, because it was me." Linda scoffed nervously. "So what? You own things on paper. That doesn't mean anything." "It means," I said calmly, "that as of tonight, your home theatre is sitting inside a house that no longer belongs to Mom and Dad." Silence. Real, suffocating silence. My mother's knees buckled, and she grabbed the back of a chair. "Catherine, please, we can fix this." "Can you?" I asked. "Can you unsell something that was never yours?" That's when my phone buzzed. Another email from the attorney. Subject line, "Temporary asset freeze approved." I didn't even need to read it out loud. My father knew. He'd spent his whole life understanding money, leverage, control, and he'd just lost all three. Linda exploded. "You planned this! You've been waiting to punish us!" I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something surprising. Pity. "No," I said. "I planned to protect my daughter. You just happened to stand in the way." Emily tugged on my sleeve. "Mom, can we go home?" I nodded. As we walked to the door, my mother called after me, voice breaking. "What are you going to do now?" I turned back one last time. "I'm going to make sure my daughter grows up knowing that her legacy is safe," I said, "and that consequences don't care who your parents are." The door closed behind us. But the story wasn't over, because the next morning, Linda did something desperate, and that's when things got truly ugly. The next morning, my phone started ringing at 6:12 a.m. It was Linda. I didn't answer. By 6:20, there were 7 missed calls. By 6:45, 2 voicemails, both unintelligible, both angry. By 7, my parents' number lit up the screen. That's when I knew Linda had done something reckless. At 8:13 a.m., my attorney called. "Catherine," he said carefully, "your sister attempted to access funds tied to the frozen accounts. She also contacted the book buyer directly." I closed my eyes. "What did she tell them?" I asked. "She claimed she was the rightful heir," he replied, "and that you coerced your parents into signing documents under duress." There it was, the final move. The buyer, already nervous after the trust flag, forwarded everything to the legal team. Linda's emails were frantic, sloppy, and worst of all, provable lies. By noon, a cease and desist was issued. By 2 p.m., Linda was formally warned about potential fraud charges. She showed up at my door at 4:37. I watched her through the window. No makeup. Hair pulled back like she was bracing for impact. The entitlement was gone. What stood there was desperation. I opened the door. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She whispered, "You've ruined me." I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. "No," I said quietly. "You ruined yourself the moment you decided my daughter was expendable." She sank onto the steps. "I just needed help. Mom and Dad always helped me. And they always expected me to clean up afterward," I replied. For the first time in her life, Linda had no one to lean on. My parents called that evening, voices small, careful. They asked if there was anything they could do. There was. I agreed to one condition. They would transfer remaining control of all estate-related decisions permanently to me and formally acknowledge Emily as the sole beneficiary of her great-grandmother's legacy. No loopholes, no temporary arrangements. They signed within the hour. Linda moved out of the house 2 weeks later. The home theatre was sold at a loss. And the rare book buyer? After the legal dust settled, they returned several items, explaining they'd felt uneasy from the start. Emily now keeps those books in a glass case in her room. Sometimes she opens one and reads out loud to me. And every time she does, I remember something Grandma Eleanor once said. Inheritance isn't about money, it's about who you trust to protect what matters. My parents learned that lesson too late, but my daughter won't have to. I thought everything would calm down after Linda moved out. I was wrong. The silence that followed was heavier than the shouting ever was. My parents stopped calling every day, then every week. When they did call, their voices sounded smaller, older, like people who had finally realized they were living inside consequences they couldn't talk their way out of. 3 months passed. One afternoon, I got a handwritten letter in the mail. From my mother, no excuses, no guilt-tripping, just shaky handwriting and a truth she'd never admitted before. She wrote that selling Emily's books hadn't been about the money. Not really. It had been about control, about proving, to herself, that she still decided what mattered in this family. She wrote, "I chose the child who needed us over the one who didn't, and I confused dependence with love." I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after reading that, not angry, just tired. Then came the unexpected part. My father asked to meet me alone. We met at a diner halfway between our houses. He looked thinner, less certain. The man who once spoke in absolutes now chose every word carefully. "I spent my life believing fairness meant keeping peace," he said. "But all I did was reward the loudest person in the room." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were revised estate documents, his idea, not the lawyer's. He'd rewritten everything to ensure Emily's inheritance could never be touched again. "Not by him, not by my mother, not by Linda. I don't expect forgiveness," he said, "but I want her protected." That mattered. Linda, on the other hand, never apologized. She took a job 3 states away. New phone number, new narrative. In her version of the story, she was the victim of a cold, calculating sister. I let her have that story, because I had something better. A year later, Emily and I visited Grandma Eleanor's grave. She brought one of the restored books with her and read a passage out loud, just like she does at home. "Mum," she asked, "did great-grandma know this would happen?" I smiled. I think she knew who would stand up when it mattered. That night, I updated my will. Not because I was afraid, but because I finally understood what real legacy is. It's not money, it's boundaries. It's choosing the child who listens, and teaching her that protecting herself doesn't make her cruel, it makes her free. And if my family ever forgets that lesson again, they already know what happens next. 2 years passed before I saw Linda again. Not at a holiday, not at a funeral, not even by accident. She showed up where she knew she couldn't be ignored, at the courthouse. I was there to finalize the last amendment to the trust. Routine paperwork, the kind of thing you do when life is finally calm enough to plan long-term. Emily was at school. I had coffee in hand. I wasn't expecting drama. Then I heard my name. "Catherine." I didn't turn right away. Some instincts don't fade. They sharpen. When I did turn, Linda was standing there with a folder clutched to her chest, eyes darting like she was already losing the argument she came to start. "I need 5 minutes," she said. Not a request. Not a demand. A plea. I checked my watch. "You have 3. She told me she was struggling, that the job hadn't worked out, that rent was going up, that her kids were asking questions she didn't know how to answer. And then, inevitably, she mentioned Emily. "How is she?" Linda asked too carefully. "She's thriving," I said. "Because she's protected." Linda nodded, then slid the folder toward me. Inside was a handwritten letter, addressed to Emily. "I just want her to know I never meant to hurt her," Linda said, "and I was hoping maybe you could help, just a little." There it was, the old pattern, different words, same expectation. I closed the folder and slid it back. "No," I said, calm, final. Her face twisted. "So that's it? You win and I get nothing?" I met her eyes. This was never a game, and I didn't win. I stopped losing. She stood there for a long moment, waiting for something. Anger, guilt, hesitation. I gave her none. Linda walked away without another word. That was the last time I saw her. A month later, the trust was finalized. Emily's inheritance is now untouchable, not just legally, but structurally. Multiple trustees, independent oversight, built to outlast family dysfunction. She doesn't know all the details. She doesn't need to. What she knows is this. Her voice matters. Her boundaries matter. And love is not proven by sacrifice demanded, but by protection given. Sometimes, late at night, I think about my parents, about Linda, about how all of this could have gone differently if fairness hadn't been treated like a threat. But regret doesn't live here anymore. Only peace and power. And a little girl turning pages that were always meant to be hers. It wasn't. Peace has a way of attracting attention, especially from people who lost control and can't stand seeing you thrive without them. About 6 months after the courthouse encounter, Emily came home from school quieter than usual. Not sad, not upset, just guarded. At dinner, she finally said, "Mom, why are people online talking about our family?" That's when I knew Linda had resurfaced. She'd found her audience. A long, emotional post was circulating on social media, shared by distant relatives, old friends, even a few strangers who love a good sob story. Linda painted herself as the abandoned sister, the one cut off, the one whose children were robbed of their future by a vindictive sibling. She never mentioned the books. She never mentioned the money. And she certainly never mentioned Grandma Eleanor's conditions. But she did mention Emily, vaguely, carefully, just enough to invite sympathy without accountability. That was her mistake. Because while Linda loved emotion, she hated facts. And I had all of them. I didn't respond online. I didn't comment. I didn't argue. Instead, I met with the attorney. 2 weeks later, Linda received a formal cease and desist for defamation and misuse of a minor's implied identity. The letter was thorough. It included documentation she'd hoped would stay buried forever. The trust terms, the unauthorized sale, the attempted fraud, the asset freeze. She deleted the posts within hours. But the damage, to her, was already done. Family members who had quietly judged me started calling. Some apologized, some didn't. But their tone had changed. The story no longer belonged to the loudest voice. It belonged to the truth. Emily asked me if we were in trouble. I knelt in front of her and said, "No, sweetheart. This is what protecting yourself looks like." A month later, we attended a small charity auction. Rare books, literacy programs, preservation efforts. Emily donated one of the restored volumes in her great-grandmother's name. It sold for more than anyone expected. The applause was soft, respectful, earned. That night, as I tucked Emily into bed, she asked, "Mum, are we done now?" I smiled. "Yes," I said, "we're done." Because revenge was never the point. Safety was. Dignity was. And making sure the cycle stopped, with me. Linda wanted attention. What she got instead was a permanent boundary, enforced by truth, law, and silence. And my daughter. She learned the most important lesson of all. You don't owe access to people who confuse love with entitlement. And sometimes, the strongest ending is the one where you walk away, holding everything that was always meant to be yours. Years passed without drama. That's how I knew the cycle was truly broken. Emily grew taller than me. Her voice changed. Her confidence settled into something natural, not forced. The books followed her through every stage of her life, first on shelves, then into careful boxes, then into a small private reading room she designed herself when she was 16. She didn't treat them like trophies. She treated them like responsibility. On her 18th birthday, I gave her the final envelope. Not Grandma Eleanor's. Mine. Inside was a letter I'd written slowly, over many nights, long after the chaos had faded. I told her the full story, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with honesty. I told her why boundaries matter more than tradition, why fairness sometimes looks like distance, why protecting yourself doesn't mean you stopped loving someone. She read it quietly. Then she hugged me and said something that told me everything I needed to know. "Mum," she said, "I don't feel angry. I feel steady." That was the moment I knew I'd done it right. My parents aged quickly after that. Regret has weight. They never crossed another boundary, not because they feared me, but because they finally understood that access is earned, not inherited. Linda remained a ghost, occasionally mentioned, never invited back in. And that was okay. Because my life wasn't defined by who left, it was defined by who was protected. Last year, Emily donated a portion of the collection, not for money, but for preservation. Her name is now quietly listed in academic circles, not as an owner, but as a steward. She told me she wants to study archival preservation. "Someone has to keep things safe," she said. I smiled, because history has a sense of humor. Sometimes I sit alone with one of the remaining books, tracing the margins Grandma Eleanor once touched. I think about how many women before me swallowed injustice because they were told that was love. I didn't. And because of that, my daughter never had to learn that lesson the hard way. This story didn't end with shouting. It ended with silence that felt like freedom. No applause, no forgiveness demanded. Just a line drawn so clearly that it never had to be redrawn again. And that's how real legacy works. Not loud, not cruel, just permanent.